What if tomorrow the world suddenly stopped trusting the US dollar? Imagine waking up and finding gas prices tripled overnight, imported goods vanished from store shelves, and your savings suddenly worth much less than yesterday. The stock market plunges, panic spreads, and nations that once depended on the United States now refuse to trade in dollars. It sounds like a movie plot, right? But what if this scenario isn't science fiction anymore? What if it's already starting to unfold? Because as we speak, powerful nations like China, Russia, and even US allies are quietly preparing for a world after the dollar. For nearly a century, the American dollar has ruled global trade, oil, and finance. It's been the ultimate symbol of trust, stability, and power. But today, that crown is starting to slip. So what happens if the United States loses its greatest weapon, not its military but its money? To understand the threat, we need to travel back in time. It's 1944. World War II is ending, and world leaders meet in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to rebuild the shattered global economy. America is the only superpower left with gold, industry, and credibility. So the world agrees, the US dollar will be the anchor of the new financial order. Every dollar would be exchangeable for gold at $35 an ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar became the foundation of global trade. It was brilliant. The United States could print the money the world needed, and the world would accept it without question. This system birthed what we now call the petrodollar, a deal where oil-exporting nations, especially Saudi Arabia, agreed to sell oil only in US dollars. Every nation on earth needed dollars to buy energy, and that kept the US on top. But power creates temptation. In 1971, President Richard Nixon shocked the world by ending the gold standard. Overnight, the dollar was no longer tied to gold, it became fiat money, backed only by government trust. Since then, the dollar's value has depended not on gold, but on belief. For decades, that belief remained strong because there was simply no alternative. The world trusted America's economy, military, and institutions. But slowly, cracks began to appear. The US started printing more dollars funding wars, bailouts, and record deficits. Trillions entered circulation, and yet because the dollar was the global default, it stayed strong. But that blind faith? It's fading. Enter BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These nations are tired of America calling all the shots. Tired of being vulnerable every time the Federal Reserve raises interest rates or the US imposes sanctions. They're building a new financial world, one that doesn't revolve around Washington. Russia, cut off from the SWIFT banking system after invading Ukraine, began demanding payment in rubles. China signed historic oil deals with Saudi Arabia paid not in dollars, but in yuan. India started settling some trade in local currencies. And central banks across the world, from Turkey to Brazil, have been buying gold at the fastest pace in modern history. These moves aren't isolated. They're part of a deliberate strategy called de-dollarization, a plan to slowly remove the dollar from global dominance and replace it with local currencies, gold, or even digital alternatives. So, what happens if this movement succeeds? What if the US loses its reserve currency status? The first shockwave would hit interest rates. Today, global demand for US dollars allows the government to borrow cheaply. Countries buy American debt because they need dollars for trade. If they stop, that demand collapses. To attract new buyers, the US would have to raise interest rates dramatically. That means higher mortgage payments, costlier car loans, more expensive credit cards, and a national debt spiral that's harder to control. The next impact would hit inflation. When fewer nations use the dollar, its value weakens. Imported goods from electronics to fuel would cost much more. Everyday Americans would feel it in every purchase. The price of living would surge while wages struggle to keep up. And then there's America's biggest weapon: sanctions. For decades, the US has used its financial power to punish countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela by freezing assets or blocking access to the global banking system. But if the dollar loses its central role, that power vanishes. Nations would trade and invest through other systems, perhaps using China's digital yuan or gold-based settlement networks. The US would no longer be the world's financial policeman. Its influence would shrink dramatically. In short, the US would go from world banker to just another borrower. And that shift would change everything from Wall Street to Main Street. Imagine oil no longer priced in dollars. Imagine China and Russia trading energy using a BRICS currency backed by gold. Imagine central banks diversifying into alternatives like the yuan or even Bitcoin. The entire global financial ecosystem would rewrite itself. Some nations would benefit massively. Commodity-rich countries, those with oil, gas, or minerals, would gain new power. Gold prices would explode as investors look for safety. Cryptocurrencies could surge as people lose trust in traditional systems. But for the average American, the picture would be painful. The dollar in your pocket would buy less every year. Retirement accounts would shrink as markets adjust. Import-heavy industries would suffer, and the U.S. government would face impossible choices: raise taxes, print more money, or slash spending. None of those options are pleasant. And here's the thing, this isn't some distant fantasy. It's already happening quietly. In 2000, 72% of the world's foreign exchange reserves were held in U.S. dollars. Today that's down to about 58%. That's a massive decline. Meanwhile, central banks are cutting their dollar holdings and stocking up on gold. The Chinese yuan, though still small, is expanding in trade settlements, especially across Asia and Africa. Countries are creating alternative payment systems to bypass the U.S. entirely. Now, does that mean the dollar will collapse overnight? Not likely. The U.S. still has deep financial markets, global trust, and a strong military. But the erosion is steady, and it's accelerating. The danger isn't a sudden crash, it's a gradual decline in influence. Imagine the dollar slowly losing purchasing power while the rest of the world shifts toward regional currencies, digital assets, and commodity-based trade. That's the real threat. Death by 1,000 cuts. So what should you do in a world where the dollar's dominance fades? First, diversify. Don't keep all your assets in one currency or one system. Gold remains a timeless hedge. It's survived every empire and currency collapse in history. Consider foreign investments or global ETFs to spread risk. Real estate, commodities, and productive assets retain value even when money loses it. Second, educate yourself. Most people don't understand how money truly works, and that's why they panic when systems change. The informed investor doesn't fear uncertainty, they prepare for it. Remember this: every empire that rose on the strength of its currency eventually saw it decline. The British pound once ruled global trade. Before that, it was the Dutch guilder. Now it's the dollar, and history suggests the next shift is inevitable. The question isn't if, it's when. But losing reserve currency status isn't necessarily the end of America. It could force the U.S. to rebalance, to produce more, to rely less on debt, and to rebuild domestic industry. It could spark innovation and efficiency if managed wisely. Yet if ignored, it could lead to inflation, inequality, and economic instability unlike anything we've seen before. The collapse of the dollar isn't just an economic story, it's about trust. The global system runs on confidence. For decades, the world trusted that America would protect its currency, maintain stability, and lead responsibly. But rising debt, political division, and endless printing have weakened that trust. Now, nations are asking a dangerous question. What happens if the dollar is no longer safe? Maybe this transition will bring balance, a multipolar world where no single country dominates trade or finance. Or maybe it will unleash new chaos: financial wars, unstable currencies, and the rise of authoritarian economic blocs. Either way, the change is coming. And when it does, the world will look very different. So before you dismiss this as another conspiracy theory or fear-mongering headline, remember, every major financial shift in history began quietly. The warning signs were always there, ignored by those who thought it could never happen. The dollar may not collapse tomorrow, but it's already losing ground. And those who understand that truth early will be the ones who adapt and thrive. Empires fall, currencies fade, but opportunity always survives. The smart investors, the ones who see the signs, prepare before everyone else. The question is, will you? Because in the end, the real power doesn't belong to governments or central banks, it belongs to those who understand how the system works. Money isn't just paper or numbers, it's trust. And when that trust breaks, everything changes. This is the story of the dollar's dominance and possibly its decline. The question now isn't whether it can fall. It's whether we're ready for what comes next.